As someone who covers NASCAR, I've noticed over the last couple of seasons one thing in particular. It's increasing in popularity. You can see it every weekend in the stands. You can also see that the demographic is getting younger. One of the reasons? Betting. NASCAR betting has exploded over the last few years. That being said, I've never been one to bet. However, due to that popularity, I've decided now it's time to learn a little bit more about gambling in NASCAR. To do that, I've called on the folks at wintherace.info. And today we have our first guest in our first episode of NASCAR Betting 101. All right, I'm happy to welcome to the channel NASCAR betting expert Greg Mathern of Win the Race. Hey, Greg, thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here. Happy to be on to talk about some NASCAR bets.
I don't know if you know what you're getting into, but I'm a newbie when it comes to betting. It's been years since I actually placed a bet, and that was with my wife on a trip to California, and we stopped in Las Vegas. I've never bet on NASCAR, so I need you to talk to me like I'm 10. Let's get started with bet types. Tell me a little bit about the betting types that you can be involved with when it comes to NASCAR.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the first thing to keep in mind is there's a huge range of them, right? And it's going to vary somewhat by, which sports book you're working with. But we've got a huge range of things that we can bet on. So obviously the most common, most predictable type of bet that people are going to look at is a bet to win. Call that an outright bet. It's just, hey, who's going to win this race, right? Um, very similar to those, we've got top three bets. Is your driver going to finish in the top three? Sometimes we call those podium bets. Top five bets. Is the driver going to finish in the top five? Top 10 bets. Is the driver going to finish in the top 10? Every once in a while, we'll get some events where we get top 20 bets even. Those were really popular a couple of years ago. I think the books kind of got beat up a bit on those. So we're seeing a little bit less of those. Right. But the great thing about NASCAR is every race gives you kind of like a range of things. Like you can bet on a race like it's an entire sports season for any other sports. Right. All right. So you've got those outrights, right? That's going to be like your championship bet for any other sport. And then you've got, some other bets that we'll talk about here. You got group bets, right? So you'll get a bet of four, maybe six drivers. And it's just, hey, which one of those drivers is going to finish the furthest ahead, right? And so you can kind of look at those for, comparison to a divisional bet in, football, baseball, or something, who's going to win their division, right? And then you get head-to-head bets. It's just, hey, which one of these two drivers is going to finish first, right? And that's going to be more of your what most people kind of typically think of as, a single game bet. Right. But we get all of these in 1 week. And that's just what's so great about it, because there's a whole host of stuff we can bet on. I think the other kind of two big bets that people really like to make are top manufacturer driver. We've got the three manufacturers in NASCAR, obviously, the Toyotas, the Fords, and the Chevrolets. Which one of them, which one of the drivers in those camps is going to finish best overall? And those will give you some kind of generous odds sometimes on drivers. And then the other bets that people seem to love to make, and I make them from time to time, are pole bets, right? Who's going to be on the pole? Um, which is, they're kind of crazy bets. Like, hey, who's going to run two fast laps, right? It's two laps. It's 60 seconds of track time that we're putting a whole lot of stake on. But that's kind of the range of where we have, and it's great because again, you've got a whole host of stuff, and the risk level kind of varies through that depending on how much you personally are willing to do on those.
Okay, so you kind of gave us a sense. I was curious if you're going to talk about the poll with obviously Mr. Logano sitting on it after last night. So I'm just curious with the types. We've got the types. So now talk to me a little bit about the odds, because I know that there can be some confusion because there can be a plus on one side and a negative on another. There can also be fractions. So so as someone who's a newbie and I'm really trying to get the very basics explained to me, talk to me about odds and how those work when it comes to NASCAR betting.
Yeah, so when most odds are going to be posted on a book, you're going to see it as a 3 or 4 digit number with either a plus or a minus in front of it. All right. And these are what we call American odds, right? And they're based on $100, right? So a bet of plus 150 means that for every 150 or every $100 you bet, you would win 150 plus 150. Now, if we flip it around and we say it's minus 150, that would mean that to win $100, you'd have to bet 150. And so American odds can be a little bit confusing in that way because plus odds are what happens if you bet 100 and negative odds are what happens to win 100. And so that's what you got to keep in mind. Certainly as we get out to some of the longer odds, you'll see, even more, right? Plus 1,000. If you bet $100, you'd win $1,000. When we get to the extreme long shots, you'll see, plus 100,000, right? I mean, like you will get out to some of these, really long shots where you could bet $100, and win $10,000, win, $100,000 in some extreme cases. It's rare to see them get quite that long, but certainly it's not unheard of to see, regular bets that are, plus 1,500 plus, in that range. The other way that people kind of regularly talk about bets, which I think is what probably most people are more commonly used to, is fractional odds, right?
Right.
And so that would be 15 to 1, right? And that's the equivalent of plus 1,500, right? It's just a little bit of a change on that. But that gives us a little bit easier understanding for a lot of people. If I say 15 to 1, most people understand, okay, if I bet $1, I'm going to win 15 on that bet. Those get a little bit more complicated when you get into some of the, what we would call negative odds and American odds, because then all of a sudden you get 5 to 6, right? And so then you got to start doing math in my head. It's like, okay, if I bet 6, I win 5. And hey, if you played craps before, yeah, those are going to be your odds on the 6 and the 8 on the craps table, right? But fractional odds are often really helpful when we start talking about the long shots. We'll say 100 to 1. That's a fractional odd, right? 100 divided by 1. So that's kind of where we see those displayed. You can generally change that on your book. There will be an option somewhere in your book when you're betting that'll let you switch how odds are displayed. So you can kind of, pull it out and display it however you want. I think a lot of handicappers will kind of switch in between the two. Again, when we get to the long shots, we'll start talking, 15 to 1. When we're talking about things that are closer to, quote, even money, plus 100, 1-to-1 bet, and then we start talking in the American odds. And almost always, most of the experts in the industry, when we're talking about anything that pays less than 1-to-1, we're going to be talking in American odds.
Okay, so just going back a little bit, to me, it feels like or seems like if you're betting 150, if it's like negative 150, you're betting negative or you're betting 150 to win 100, right? Is that the
Right.
way? So to me, that those numbers don't seem like good odds, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a misconception that a lot of people have is they start worrying about, oh, what's my return on this? And that's not a great way to think about bets. You could have an 100 to 1 bet. That's a terrible bet. You could have a minus 150 bet. That's a great bet. And so what you have to realize is that all of these odds have imputed into them what we call implied probability, right? It's what does that odd translate to and how often that event has to happen for you to break even on that bet, right? So the easiest one to think about is a 1-to-1 bet, a plus 100 bet. The implied probability behind that is 50%, right? It's 50. If you won a 1-to-1 bet 50% of the time, you would break even. And so when we're making that bet, we had to look at what do we think the probability of this event actually happening is, right?
Right.
So when you talk about minus 150, right? That's, a bet that, people would look at and say, "Oh, that's not great." Now, I'll be perfectly honest. There are people who can do this math in their head. I am not one of them. I have a calculator right here that I'm going to pull up real quick that's going to tell me And you would think for something that obvious, I would remember off the top of my head, but I don't. All right. So I'm going to look, I pulled it up. I'm going to look at, what the implied odds of a minus 150 bet are. Right. And the implied odds of that are 60%. Right. So if you won a minus 150 bet 60% of the time, you would end up breaking even. So when we're making that bet, what we got to look at is, do we think it's more than 60% likely for that to happen? A great example of this, and he's retired now, so we're not going to get these anymore, is Kevin Harvick at Phoenix to finish in the top 10, right? The man was a machine at Phoenix. He was a lock. He was going to finish in the top 10 every time. And yet we would get minus 150 on him to finish in the top 10. Okay. Was it actually 100% that he was going to finish in the top 10? No, of course not. There were going to be, incidents or something that could happen. But could I confidently say the odds of Kevin Harvick finishing in the top 10 at Phoenix were probably in the 85 to 90% range? Yeah, I could. And so it was well over those implied odds of 60%. So yeah, I made a lot of money off of Kevin Harvick top 10 at Phoenix, betting those minus odds, because I could look at that and go, no, the probability of him doing this is way more than what's implied by those odds. So I'm going to make that bet. The flip side of that is on the plus money odds. You say, oh, well, I've got a, plus 250, right? So I'm going to win, 250 for every dollar I bet, right? Well, the implied odds on plus 250 are going to come out to 28.57%. All right. So we look at that and go, all right, that feels like good odds. And we see this a lot for, I picked that specific number because we see this a lot for the group bets, right? So you get four drivers, right? And you'll see most of them hovering somewhere around plus 250. And you're like, oh, that's pretty good odds. Well, the implied odds of that are 28.57, right? Well, if we add that up four times, we're going to be over 100%, right? So that's not necessarily a great bet if you think that group is effectively a coin flip, I guess coin flip four times as to which one of them is going to win. You have to, reach the conclusion that, hey, this driver is going to win 30% of the time for that to become a good bet. And so that's really a hard thing for a lot of bettors to get their heads around, is looking at that plus or minus isn't what determines if a bet is a good bet. Looking at the implied probability behind it, and then what we think the actual probability of the bets are. That's where we find our money. That's where we find our value.
Okay, I know in reading some of your content, which I encourage all of my viewers and subscribers to go check out at wintherace.info, some great, tutorials, articles on betting 101. So I know in there you talk about units. So kind of explain to me, because it's not so much you're worried about the money as much as you are the units, because the units, it seems like it shows you kind of your averages on your success rate versus worrying about the dollars themselves. So kind of, can you explain that a little bit to me?
Yeah. So, it's hard to translate in between multiple bettors sometimes. So there's a couple of reasons that we do this, right? All right. The most obvious reason is for me personally, or for you personally as a bettor. You don't want to be, tilting at some bets and, kind of small on others and just all over the place, because you're going to be inconsistent, right? And that's going to lead to, losses. Like if somebody ever tells you like, this is the guaranteed lock of the century, bet everything you have on it, please don't bet that. All right. I would be perfectly honest. I've seen that. I've been there 20 years ago. Not quite 20 years ago, but 15 years ago. I was there when I didn't quite understand what I was doing. And I was like, oh, this is a great bet. And that's not to say that there aren't some bets that are more valuable than others, and I will bet more than one unit on it, right? But nothing's ever a lock, right? There's risk involved in all of this. And so by betting a consistent unit size, we're staying consistent, we're staying true to our process. And if we are making good bets in the long run, we will be profitable, right? If every time we're making a one unit bet, and I'll explain the specifics of that in a second, we are having our the actual probability of the event occurring is better than the implied probability of the odds. In the long run, we will make money. All right. We might lose money in the short term, but in the long run, we'll make money. And that's the value of the unit bet is it's going to keep us from running out of bankroll, right? So if you look at what a lot of experts will say is that your unit size should be somewhere around one, maybe if you're going like totally hard, up to 5% of your bankroll. But I think that's incredibly aggressive, right? And the point is, if you lose 100 bets in a row, right? So if your unit size is 1% of your bankroll, right? You'd have to lose 100 bets in a row before you ran out of money. If you do that, maybe it's time to find a new hobby, right? I mean, you clearly don't have the edge that you think you have, and it's probably time to, to find a new hobby, right? But the point is, it's going to preserve your bankroll. It's going to give you consistency, and it's going to let you grow the time. The other reason that it's really helpful is it helps explain to our, audience how much I value a bet, right? Because my unit size is $200 on NASCAR, right? If I bet a unit on NASCAR, I'm betting $200 on that bet, right? Well, if you have a $500 bankroll, a $200 bet to you is a whole lot different than a $200 bet to me. And so you might see that and go, oh, wow, 200, that's an amazing bet. Well, no, that's an average bet for me. I don't view that as an exceptional bet, whereas that would be absolutely, crazy. That would be 40% of your bankroll if you have a $500 bankroll. And so it's really helpful to, talk about bet size when we do that so that others understand how I'm valuing a bet. If I told you I bet 2 units on a bet, you're like, oh, okay, he values that more. That's one that I want to put more on. And that's more useful information to my audience than knowing I bet $400 on it, right? Because without context, me saying I bet $400, is that a great bet? Is that an average bet? I mean, there are guys who bet, $1,000 on a bet. To them, that's, well under. And so it's helpful to, think of it that way. And again, it's another really helpful tool for bankroll management.
Okay, so let's just say you've got your bankroll, you've figured out the units that you want to use, and now you've got your types of bets. So where do you go? I'm in Texas, so I can't actually bet legally. So where do people who can legally bet, where do they go online? How do they determine what is the right place for them to go? Do they go to multiple places? Kind of educate me on choosing where you're going to go place your money.
Sure. So you're going to want to have an account with every single book that's available to you in your state, right? So I'm in Virginia. We have 14 licenses in the state. One of them just announced yesterday or the day before, Unibet, that they're leaving the state, unfortunately. So we'll go down a little bit. But you're going to want to have an account with every book. And the reason for this is the odds are going to vary across the book, particularly in a sport like NASCAR, right? So when you look at the NFL, is there some fluctuation in between books? Sure, absolutely. You saw that as we approached the Super Bowl. You had some books who had, a little more favored towards the 49ers. And so you saw some books that might have 49ers -2 versus 49ers -1.5. And very, very briefly for anyone who doesn't know those, when you're betting on a sport that has points, your most common line is the spread. And so that is expressed in a plus number or minus number again. And it's, hey, is this team going to win by, a minus number would be, hey, they got to win by this number for your bet to cash, and a plus number would be they have to either win outright, or if they lose, but they lose by less than that number, your bet would win, right? And so you saw a little bit of fluctuation in that, but it wasn't much, right? The difference was half a point, right? Half a point here or there. And as we know, it ended up not mattering, right? The Chiefs won by 3, so it didn't end up mattering, right? But for NASCAR, you're going to see wide variation, right? You will see some books where a driver might be plus 800 versus another book they're plus 1100 plus 1200, and so all of a sudden you're getting a huge swing there, right? The difference between 8-1 and 12-1, man, that return is pretty significant, and the implied odds on that are pretty significant too, right? A plus 1200 odds is implied odds of 7.69%, right? Versus 800 is 11.11%, right? That's a huge swing there. So that takes us from maybe a bet being a whole lot of value at one book to being absolutely no value at another. And so you want to have an account at every single book that you can. And I have typically tried to keep at least one or two units of money in every book, right? That way I don't have to worry about depositing every time that I want to make a bet. It's like, oh, hey, I can make that bet quickly. Particularly when you have a smaller bankroll, there are definitely times where, you might have to shuffle money around between some books. It's like, okay, I got to withdraw from one book to put into another. And that's okay if that's what you have to do. But it is, again, it is important to look at those and, be checking the odds at every book because you're gonna get very different odds. And if you're not using every book available to you, you're giving away money, right? Because even if that same bet wins, let's go back to that, 8-1 versus 12-1. And I don't know what the current odds are, but there was a point at which you could get that range of odds on Denny Hamlin to win the Daytona 500, right? Okay, if I bet that at 8-1 versus betting at 12-1, I've just given away a ton of money, right? At $100 unit size, by betting it at 8-1, I just gave away $400 if he wins. You can't afford to give away that money, and so you need to have every book that you can.
So when you're looking at the books, are there some that have, I mean, obviously they have different odds, but are there some that you can go and place bets during a race that they have prop bets during the race that show up, or is that even a thing?
Yeah, that's a thing, and it varies by books as to what they offer. The most common thing, and in some cases, most cases, I would say the only thing that's available is you'll get live odds on the winner of the race, right? And most books generally do have live odds on the winner. There are a couple last year, I want to say Bet365 had live head-to-head odds for drivers during the race, which was kind of nice. But that's pretty rare. I think they were the only ones who had that. Caesars might have had them for a little bit too, actually, now that I think about it. But you'll have to look, and we'll have to see what comes available to us this year. I was a little disappointed in Bet365 specifically yesterday. Actually, they didn't have qualifying odds, and they had great qualifying odds for us last year. So we'll have to see, kind of depends on who has stayed with the books, in terms of their actually underlying odds makers as to what's going to be offered. 3 years ago, DraftKings offered a huge range of books. And then, as I understand it, their primary NASCAR guy left, and so last year their odds offerings were not quite as good. They kind of swung back up towards the end of the year. They might have hired somebody new, but so that's important to look at because you're going to get different opportunities at the different books.
All right, Greg, that is a lot to absorb. I will study up. And I will pretend bet, like I said, I'm in Texas. I will pretend bet this weekend for the Daytona 500. I'm gonna write a column this year every weekend and just kind of do just special bets and see what my record is for the year and go back and look. And then maybe at some point I'll get to bet legally. So we'll see. So again, I appreciate you joining us here on the channel. It's been really informative. I think my audience will really appreciate this and have a better understanding going into the season of what they want to do and how they want to spend their money. So again, appreciate it. Look forward to having you back on the channel at different points during the season. Wish you the best of luck in your betting ventures this year, and I look forward to seeing you again here in 2024.
Absolutely, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, thanks, Greg. Take care.